Welcome. Good evening and welcome to the oiip, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. As the scientific director, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is entitled "The Militarization Meets Patriarchy, the Brewing of a Toxic Mix." And I'm very pleased to welcome Cynthia Enloe of Clark University in Boston here with us tonight. This event is part of our 40 years anniversary celebrations at OIIP, and it is also part of the IPW lecture series of the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, and we're very, very grateful for the support of the department. What we're celebrating this year is really 40 years of tirelessly working at the intersections of academic research, policy consultancy, and public engagement. And the events that we have launched for this year, they're not only to celebrate, but they're really our efforts to raise the really big questions of international politics. And these big questions today very much extend beyond traditional interstate relations, diplomacy, security institutions, militaries, and war. Which is not to say that these issues don't matter anymore, but I think we cannot afford any longer to look at them from a detached, seemingly neutral position where we don't interconnect with the everyday lives of people. We look at these things in isolation from local contexts, from the inequalities and power struggles that very often cut across the global-local divides. So, as the only independent think tank and research institute in international politics in Austria, it is our mission to really grasp these interconnections and to talk about how the high-level politics of international relations is connected to the local, to the everyday, and to the power struggles that, like I said, cannot be placed somewhere else in the Security Council, in the global geopolitical arenas, but they are happening everywhere, and we need to make these connections. So we try to integrate the small-scale actors and events on the ground, be it women's peace movement in Bosnia, be it radicalized youth in the outskirts of Vienna, be it migrants detained in the EU's neighboring countries, or the doings of transnational pharmaceutical corporations. All of this matters to us and to international relations. And this is why in all of our focal areas, we stand for an ethnographic, embedded, bottom-up approach to international politics. And this is also why there couldn't be a better speaker in honor of our anniversary than Professor Cynthia Enloe, who has shaped and brought to life such an approach to international relations that always centers the marginalized and those that are normally considered to be irrelevant to the high politics of international relations. Now, the usual way to introduce such a speaker is to list their academic accomplishments, their badges of academic honor, but today we have the internet for you to all read up on this. Let me just say that Cynthia Enloe is a research professor at the Department of International Development, Community and Environment, also affiliated with the Political Science and the Women's and Gender Studies programs at Clark University. She has authored 15 monographs, numerous articles. Just a brief mention of her latest book, The Big Push, Exposing and Challenging Persistent Patriarchy. I think this is also going to inform a lot of what we're going to hear tonight. There's also a thoroughly updated and revised second edition of her discipline-changing book, Bananas, Beaches and Bases, originally published in 1989. She holds numerous honorary degrees, she received numerous awards. Please read up on this impressive track record online. I think, Cynthia, you once told me you were an anthropologist by training?
No, that was a wannabe. That's what I wanted to be. That's just wishful thinking.
Okay, good. Well, then I cannot say what I was just going to say. Anyways, Cynthia changed the way we look at international relations by asking a seemingly very simple question, namely, where are the women? And this shifts our focus completely onto the invisible, productive, reproductive, emotional labor of women that sustains the global war system, that sustains the global political economy. And to understand what a tremendous shift this really is, do picture yourself as a first-year political science student, if you aren't, or haven't been, and you're taking your introductory course in international relations in the late 1990s, probably still today, depending on where you study. And then you would learn about how states behave in the international order, why they do that. You learn concepts like the balance of power and how states are these self-interested black boxes. And this detached, allegedly neutral, seemingly very scientific way of looking at international relations made many of us feel that this had very little to do with us, and that international relations had very little to offer to those that were interested in global power struggles and in how it affected real people. Some of us were lucky enough to read Cynthia's work. Mostly that was back then, in courses that were not explicitly dedicated to international relations. It could be in anthropology, could be in history, could be in women's studies. And there we would read on militarized culture, on how masculinities and femininities were shaped to support militarism, how plantation workers, diplomatic wives, migrant nannies all matter to sustaining global inequalities. And suddenly it would all make sense. And never in 1,000 years would I have thought back then that I would one day be lucky enough to invite Cynthia here and to extend this gift of hearing her speak and speaking with her about these important questions that are still as relevant today as when I first thought about them as an undergraduate. And you may probably think that militarization and its link to patriarchy is not something that concerns us in the Austrian context on an everyday level. We have a very small scale military, we have an anti-militarist consensus after World War II. But you may want to think again, because of course Austria is part of the EU, is part of efforts to strengthen cooperation in the defense sector, entitled PESCO, for example. And it's also part of ongoing processes of militarization, particularly border policing, with very dire consequences for the most vulnerable migrants. And also we're seeing quite extreme anti-feminist, anti-equality sentiments spreading across Europe. We just had a deadly attack on a synagogue in the German city of Halle, which was not only justified by anti-Semitism, but also very much tied to anti-feminism. And also we have a situation where right now the Central European University has just been made to leave Hungary and is now trying to find its feet here in Vienna. A very warm welcome to everybody who came from CEU tonight. We're happy you're here, but you shouldn't have to be, right? So yeah, in this sense, pressing issues around militarization and patriarchy today that extend beyond the US context, which I think we all very often think of first when hearing militarism and militarization. Cynthia, I'm forever grateful that you made this long journey to be with us tonight. It means the world to this institute and the wider feminist community. And the floor is yours.
First of all, many thanks to Saskia and to the Institute for having me. This is my first time at the Institute. It's a very lively, exciting intellectual community that obviously is building community. All the people who are here from CEU, could everyone turn around? Who's here from CEU? A special thank you, applause. It matters a lot to all of us that you're here, right? So be sure when we, break up afterwards, be sure you introduce yourselves to people, get to be part of this community. You'll make it a richer community by your being here. So we're delighted. We're delighted. When Saskia and I started thinking about, well, actually, it was over a year ago, wasn't it? Oh my God. But when we started thinking about titles are really hard, right? Titles are always really hard. Either they're so bland that who would want to come because, or they're so limited that you have the same effect, the same 5 people want to come. But I chose this. I didn't choose the salutes, by the way. That's not part of my thing. I don't think any student has ever saluted me. But I did want to talk about patriarchy because I think it's a concept that a lot of us are very nervous about using. We may use it over coffee or over something stronger, although I don't think there's anything stronger than Viennese coffee. It's very buzzy. But we may use it when we talk about the hashtag #MeToo movement. We may use it when we talk about other, there's a chair way up here. Yep. Yeah, come on, I just gave one away. There we go. But I think a lot of us are reluctant to use it in some of our writing because it feels as though maybe it's too abstract or it will send out too many signals to people that we're worried to send out signals to. And I used to be that way. I think one of those books, I did mention the first time a colleague of mine ever said patriarchy. And I can remember we were at a picnic table at Wellesley College, and it was one of the first ever conferences on, quote, women and development. Those 3 words had never been put together before, and Wellesley College hosted this conference, very lively, wonderful conference, called Women and Development. None of us knew what that meant, but we all were excited to be there. And at the picnic table, a woman that I had known from work in Malaysia, she wasn't Malaysian, but she worked on the Philippines, but we met in Malaysia. She, at the picnic table, it was a beautiful June afternoon, and we were eating salads, and she said the word patriarchy. I'm not kidding. I thought it was so scary. I got up. This is a conference on women and development, mind you. I got up from the table. I made some excuse that I had to go refill my iced coffee or something, and left the table because I thought, I don't want to be part of this conversation. And I looked back. I really try to remember that. Aren't there certain scenes like that you can recreate right down to the blade of grass? And it's usually ones where you were scared or nervous or embarrassed, and you leapt up and tried to get out of the room. And that was me, and I try to remember that because I try to remember what did I think she was talking about. Because this is the point where in a 3-day conference on women and development, nobody else said the P word. So it wasn't, it's in the air, right? This was just this colleague of mine, Jean Grosholz, who was a specialist on Philippines politics. And here's what I thought. So I try to remember what I thought was so scary. It's a really good thing to remember when you weren't a feminist, because you weren't always a feminist. I can almost guarantee you that you weren't always a feminist, right? And it's really good to remember, or maybe some of you are still not quite there, but it's a process, isn't it? It's a process. It's not, you're there and now you're home free and you don't have to think anymore. No. But I try to think what I thought was so scary and or irrelevant, both, about patriarchy. And here's what I thought when I look back on it, that beautiful June afternoon at the picnic table. I think I thought it was so abstract. That was the first thing. And I thought I already knew at that point. And at that point, I was just creeping towards a feminist analysis of anything. I don't even think at that point I called it a gender analysis. I think I was right into the feminist analysis of something. At that point, I probably had finished, I'm almost sure I had probably finished writing, and maybe it was already published, what became my last non-feminist book. But you know, when you write your last non-feminist book, you don't know it's your last non-feminist book. And this was a book about racism in militaries around the world. And I learned a lot from that. But I think what I knew I wasn't interested in, and what I was kind of scared of, is other people wielding what sounded to me like abstract concepts. I thought, it wasn't only that I thought I couldn't understand them, and I really didn't think of myself as intellectual enough to understand big concepts. So that was scary, because it meant I immediately shouldn't be in this conversation because I won't understand what they're talking about. But it was also that I thought, if there's anything I had learned in, 7 years of studying the workings of ethnocentrism and racism in militaries. I mean, I'm not kidding. And you could have shook me at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, who's in the Kenyan Air Force? And I'd say Kikuyu. I mean, I was way deep in the weeds of how racism works in militaries, and it works in virtually every military. But I hadn't raised questions about gender. And I knew already that I didn't want to work with abstractions. That abstractions, to me, this is early on, abstractions to me meant that I would miss seeing things rather than seeing things. And so that was the first thing. I think the second thing is that I thought that anybody who talked about patriarchy wouldn't be interested in the stuff I was beginning to try and understand. I was really trying to understand women who do paid domestic work as versus unpaid domestic work. Paid domestic work. And I was becoming really interested. I am interested in political economy as well as militarism. And I was really interested in particularly Filipino women. If you want to understand the world, are there any Filipinas in the room? Okay. If there, I was going to say then we'll just turn it over to her. Because if you want to understand how the global system, the global many-threaded processes work, I tend to think that way rather than system for the same reason. Just sit down with a whole bunch of Filipinas and ask them about how Filipinas work in the world. And you will find out about the international politics of migration, the international politics of terrorism and counterterrorism, the international politics of nursing, definitely the international politics of nursing. I wonder how many Filipino nurses there are now in Austrian hospitals. A lot, you think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right? Policy. And, yeah, well, and the international politics of domestic work. And I thought anybody who's interested in this thing I thought they meant by patriarchy won't be interested in these things that I'm now really excited about, these new things that I was excited about. But I've changed my mind. And I think I've changed my mind partly because I no longer see it as an abstraction. I see patriarchy as a way to turn on the lights in the room, or better yet, to turn on a light in that corner where we all think we understand the room, but that corner has remained dark, and I want to know what's going on in that room. That is, patriarchy to me is, and I'll explain what I mean by it, but patriarchy now to me is a way of shining light on workings of power and disempowerment and oppression that otherwise you don't see. And that to me is the test of a concept. And as a concept, you don't fling out a concept or drop it casually into conversation. That's even more insidious. You don't use a concept to make yourself sound like an intellectual, which in all our settings is oftentimes a big temptation because you're constantly trying to get bars on your, or the invisible bars on your shoulders so that you can be taken seriously as an intellectual. That is the worst time. The worst reason to use any concept, is because it makes you sound smart, right? But that is how we all sell our soul almost daily, right? So it's really worth putting out there what not to use a concept for. A concept really has to prove itself. It has to actually show you that you are seeing things and understanding things in ways that you otherwise haven't, or that you've missed. So I'll give you an example that really affected my life, and that is the concept of sexual harassment. You can date it, that's 1979. Before 1979, nobody's using English anyway, nobody put sexual together with harassment. And I remember being in a small office of a really five-woman activist group in a small shared office in Boston, and I was trying to support my Chilean feminist anthropologist colleague who was being treated badly. You have to think how you spoke about these things before you had the concept, right? Was being treated badly by her sociology department chair, male. And I was trying to support Jimena because I had tenure, right? Structure matters, folks. You know, I wasn't brave, I had tenure, right? And I was trying to support Jimena, and friends of ours who were hearing of what she was going through from this guy said, oh, here's a small group that mainly works with women working on assembly lines in an industrial neighborhood of Boston. But they've been working on the abuse of power by male foremen on the line. And they've been trying to support women to bring charges and to articulate what is a violation of labor rights. That was their puzzle. And they said, go talk to these people, even though they don't work about on academic issues, maybe they will give you some hints about strategizing. So we went, Jimena and I, we sat in this little office, had 3 chairs, and one for the activists and 2 for Jimena and me. And Jimena said what this chair had been doing, exposing himself, and because she was a full professor. This is really interesting about power. She was a full professor, the youngest full professor in the history of Chile. She had to go into exile because of Pinochet. But at Clark, at my university, that meant she was totally vulnerable because she was on a visa. So much for being a very accomplished feminist anthropologist and having status within the academy in Chile. In the US, what she was somebody that a department chair could wield the threat of not renewing that visa. Right? All of you from CEU this will all sound much too familiar. But it really is true. So that somebody who looks accomplished, who looks as though they have status, high status, it depends on where they are structurally. And if you're in exile and you depend on your chair to renew your visa, all of a sudden you don't have status anymore. Well, you do have status, and that is the status of being vulnerable. And so Jimena described this, and Nancy, I can still remember her name, Nancy said, we are now calling that sexual harassment. And I said, Nancy, could you say those words again? I had never heard those. Hi there. There's floor. Oh, there's a seat. Yeah, great. Yeah, that's good. I said, Nancy, could you say those 2 words again? And she said, sexual harassment. And I had never heard those 2 words put together before. And that's a concept that works, because what it did is it made visible a pattern of labor abuse that otherwise are called the jerk. You know the jerk in the office? Right. The lech, right? The man who's lecherous towards a woman in the workplace. That's all we had. And that doesn't show patterns. And what it absolutely doesn't show, so this is a concept that works. What it absolutely didn't show, it didn't show all the people whose passivity enabled it. If we knew about anything, we knew about the one jerk to never get in the elevator with, right? We knew about the guy never to work late with, right? But what we didn't know, and what sexual harassment as a concept gave us, is a new curiosity we're still learning, a new curiosity about how it's all enabled. So patriarchy began to be useful to me because I began to see that it showed me relationships that the concept of sexism didn't. So let me say what I mean by patriarchy, because patriarchy is also something that becomes, again, I think one of the things that I didn't like at first, when I first heard the term patriarchy and ran away from the picnic table, is I didn't think it had enough process in it. And you'll see that that's one of the things that really I find so useful about the concept of militarization. The most powerful part of this concept is the isation, right? Because it shows process. And at first, because patriarchy didn't have enough process in it, it sounded like it was either existed or it didn't exist. And that's just not, this is part of my own limitation, that's just not very interesting to me. But here's what I watch over time, and I suggest you take an organization or a group or a community or a social interaction and chart it over time and see if you can tell if it's becoming more or less patriarchal. Because that will really be a test of whether you get it or whether you still don't quite understand how to use it, or whether it's got a very dim light and not as shiny, bright a light as you hoped. Because you can take your family, take multi-generations, and watch it over time. Take something you really know the nuances of, right? If you're in a sports club, take a sports club and watch it over time. Any kind of social group, take it and see if you can watch over time whether it has become more patriarchal or less patriarchal. And then you'll know that you're on your way to having a concept that is actually useful to you. So, patriarchy, this is the very simple form of it that I tend to use. Patriarchy is a belief that men and women, and gender and sex get collapsed in patriarchy. Men and women are in parallel silos. And it's knowable what is masculine and what is feminine. And they are again collapsed into women and men, which is why the trans movement has, stirred up so many of the patriarchs. But that wasn't the first. I can remember in the early years when I hope you still do, but reading everything. I mean, there was no such thing as your discipline. You just read everything, right? So I read a lot about tomboys, right? And I remember tomboys, which is it used in European English at all? Tomboys are girls who like to play boy sports. Not b-boys, play boy sports, right? The mother who worries because her daughter climbs trees. So tomboys are, it's not about being trans, it's about just breaking open the notions of what's proper girlhood, right? And so patriarchy really is nervous about breaking down these parallel lines. It's one of the reasons why the Vatican, as a delegation to the United Nations, really doesn't like gender to be put into any treaty, right? And the way for you to track that, and the Vatican is a very good Vatican in the United Nations. Now we're talking about the delegation in New York and also in Geneva. They work really hard to try and get gender either taken out of UN documents or to be so minimized that it doesn't have any effect on what the UN is going to commit itself to doing. And the place to go and track that, and there have been a number of articles that have been written by activists. We still don't have much yet. I'm trying to think. We still don't have much yet by academics, is the Arms Trade Treaty. That's in UNEs, it's called the ATT. The Arms Trade Treaty, which was ratified by the General Assembly of the United Nations in April 2013, has within it Article 7. I only know this because UN feminist lobbyists teach me these things. And they said that is our biggest accomplishment because in Article 7 of the ATT, the feminists and their allies managed to get in that governments are, under this treaty, if they ratify it, has Austria ratified the ATT, do you think? Yes, good. Of course, the United States has because of the power of the gun law. But the Article 7 says that governments are themselves responsible for checking to see whether any of their private arms exporters are exporting firearms to countries that have a pattern of gender-based violence. That's in the AT&T, and that's a huge accomplishment because the Vatican really wanted it only in the prelude. And preludes are not actionable. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I don't know a lot about. But if you are with people who are lobbying really hard and they tell you what is the mountain you have to cross, then in fact you learn these things. So that's the first part of patriarchal thinking and acting and valuing things, right? Because any ideology is not just what you believe. Beliefs are how you think the world works, right? Beliefs are, is human nature in its essence, selfish? That's a belief. The second part of an ideology is what you value, what you think is good, and what you think is less good or really bad, right? So beliefs and values. You have to, and most of us know the values of our friends. We actually don't know the beliefs of our friends. You have to have much longer conversations with your favorite uncle to have, this is why holiday dinners can be so interesting. And that is to dig deeper and find out, well, what do they believe about how the world works or how societies work? And so the second patriarchal belief that is also actionable is that, that what is masculine is superior to what is feminine. And that there's a hierarchy between what is masculine and what is feminine. So this is when you hear women who've been active in electoral politics, as some of our guests here tonight are. One of the biggest glass ceilings to break is that men are better because of their masculinity at public affairs. That's been one of the hardest things to break open society by society and in every international organization. That men are just naturally better at, that's how you build hierarchies, international affairs. Women are better at childcare. That would be fine if childcare and international affairs were given equal value. So the second thing about becoming more patriarchal is not only that you believe that men are men and women are women, and there's something called femininity that is pretty static, and there's something called masculinity that is pretty narrow, which is why gay men really upset the apple cart, and why homophobia is so crucial to patriarchy. The third thing is, on the other hand, that patriarchy needs femininity. It needs women to be women. It's not like there's a hierarchy and the thing that is devalued is dispensable. That's not patriarchal thinking. Patriarchal thinking is that women are, or people who are feminine, are crucial to reproducing the family, which is why nationalists, that many of you are too familiar with, why nationalists in many different cultures, are so keen on bringing women into the nationalist movement. But they are keen on it because they have an image of what the best kind of family is for the strengthening of the nation. which means if you're interested, I mean, you all know this if you're studying what's going on here in Europe, but it's a really big mistake to imagine that patriarchal people, women and men, you can be patriarchal and be woman, women and men, that they imagine that women are dispensable. No, they imagine that women have their place and that place is valuable, it's just not as valuable as the places the people who prove their masculinity inhabit. It's one of the reasons why for a lot of women in the history of nationalist movements, and I remember being informed on this by Vietnamese nationalists, they said, look, nationalist movements, especially if they're against a colonial power, but even if they're against a local dictator, as in Nicaragua in the 1970s, nationalist movements can be very appealing to a lot of women because for the first time, what women do is valued for the nation. If you ever go to Tokyo, I think it's usually on Friday nights, the Tokyo Women in Black, which is a big anti-militarist network in a lot of countries, but it also has at least 3 different local groups in Japan. They will stand outside the biggest neon signs out at the bottom of the steepest. Have many of you been to Tokyo? Learning the subways. Don't you feel so you should get a couple of ribbons, right? For learning the Tokyo subways? Well, you know that outside, yeah, in Shinjuku, right? But one of the things that Tokyo Women in Black began to protest is the blocking out of the memory of what housewives contributed to nationalist militarism in the years leading up to World War II in Japan. And so here they were protesting against Japanese contributions to the US-led invasion in Iraq when I was there. That was what they were out protesting. But in their circle, they were also trying to bring up to visibility our rethinking, our meaning Japanese feminists, rethinking what Japanese women as housewives did to contribute to Japanese nationalism. And a lot of women and girls join nationalist movement because it's so appealing to be valued. In the 1920s, one of the innovative publications that the anti-French Vietnamese nationalists put out, this was the movement then headed by Ho Chi Minh, who was in exile at that point. They put out cookbooks for Vietnamese cooking, so that Vietnamese cooking wouldn't be denigrated below Chinese cooking. Because in Vietnamese nationalism, you had to be proud of food that otherwise was thought of as peasant food, which didn't mean you weren't as good as French cooks, you weren't as good as Chinese cooks. It was a double, nationalism. So nationalism is very appealing, but it has that notion that in a patriarchal system, what you're valued for is, first of all, limited, and second of all, it's always lesser than what is most valued. So patriarchy doesn't devalue women, it lessens the value compared to whatever can be masculinized. So patriarchy can be very appealing to women. And the final part is that, so patriarchy assumes that there is something called the masculine, something called the feminine. They are in hierarchy to each other, unequal to each other. And here's the third, and I think really crucial part of patriarchal thinking, is that in order for women to continue to be valuable in society, they must be controlled by men. So it's not just unequal, it's a power dynamic. That women need to have their sexuality controlled. That women need to have their aspirations controlled. that women need to have their reproductive capacities controlled. It is that final part of patriarchy that is usually the first thing that women try to break out of, right? And if you look at the history of women's movements across the world, it'll be that control, what you wear, how you act, what kind of schooling you can get, can you ride a bicycle, is a new industrial sewing machine too sexualized, which was the argument in Europe, against the new Singer sewing machine. And isn't it amazing the things we all learn? I know. It's because we all read feminist historians. I mean, don't just read political scientists, please. Really. I mean, because if you do, well, you know all the reasons. The militarization depends, and this is needs. Needs is the power word here, right? Because if something needs something else to push forward, remember militarization is a process. It doesn't happen, you're not militarized on Monday and then you're militarized on Tuesday. That's not how things happen. That need says depends on. And if something depends on something else, it's got causal power. Right? If something has causal power, of course, it means that you disrupt the thing that militarization as a process depends on. You disrupt any part of that three-part patriarchal process, and in fact, you endanger militarization. So, how can you feel as though you're jeopardizing those three processes of patriarchy and yet not challenge militarization? And of course the most obvious, although it's hard to talk about, so don't get me wrong here, and that is women taking on uniformed roles in state militaries. Because when that's been proposed in various countries, in South Africa, there was a lot of push in 1994 not to let the percentage of women in the South African state military slip, because it had been begun to rise under the apartheid regime, because it was the only way that you could fight the increasing mobilization of black South Africans and recruit more white women. This is the Calvinist, patriarchal National Party that was in control during the 1980s and into 1994. They started recruiting women into the South African state military. But in a lot of militaries, it looks as though it's breaking through patriarchy. When I have the good fortune of talking to women who are fighting sexism inside their own militaries, and this is a lot of women in a lot of countries today, I have to be really careful. I mean, careful, not like being, quote, diplomatic, but I mean really watch my lazy thinking and not slip into assuming or acting as though I'm somehow arrogant and assuming that they are dupes or puppets. Because people join militaries for all kinds of reasons, with all kinds of aspirations, with all kinds of needs. But it is true that women who join militaries, certainly since they're fighting sexism, and in the US military, and I'm guessing in other militaries, they are usually fighting sexual assault by their male colleagues as well. They feel as though they are fighting patriarchy, right? To get promotions, to be taken, their skills to be taken seriously, to get positions of command, to make careers. It feels they are fighting sexism. The real puzzle for me is it in a way that actually is strengthening patriarchy even though it's fighting sexism? And I leave that as not leave it, but I put it out there as a question rather than thinking that any of us know the answer. There's a wonderful book by Mary Katzenstein, K-A-T-Z, Katzenstein. And Mary is a political scientist, and she, I always get the title mixed around. It's either the fearless and the faithful, or the faithful and the fearless. But look up Mary Katzenstein, it's Princeton University Press. And she did an ethnographic, interview-based study of women who are nuns in the American Catholic Church and their efforts to break open the patriarchy of the American Catholic Church compared to women in the uniformed services of the American state military and their efforts to fight sexism in the military. What Mary, I won't kind of give it away at the end, but what's how she came to this and what she heard from both feminist nuns and feminists in uniform. She came to the conclusion that it was the feminist nuns who were most deeply feminist, more so than the women in uniform, because she found from her interviews, and this would vary maybe by military, what she found was that the women in uniform had to stop short of raising questions about militarism. They fought sexism, they took enormous risks, but they did not challenge militarism. They were too invested in that package of ideas, whereas the nuns, any of you know any radical nuns? Again, Filipino radical nuns are way off the charts, right? Start with them. But start with radical nuns in almost any country, and they actually raise questions about patriarchy. It's really, it's an interesting study, Mary Katzenstein. So militarization can oftentimes be stymied by exposing the extent to which it supports, furthers, deepens the roots of patriarchy. And it's one of the reasons why I found that to study militarization, I have to ask feminist questions. And I have to ask how so many people who don't, women and men, who look as though they are not benefiting from militarism in their society or in their region, why, in fact, they don't challenge it. That militarization, like anything, has its rewards, right? And for many women, and some of the most interesting women to really be serious in your curiosity about, are women married to men who are soldiers, right? In whatever military you know. And when I was studying at Berkeley as a mere political scientist, I thought that only sociologists talk about people called wives. That's not what political scientists aren't interested in people called wives, right? I mean, that just shows, how stupid you would be. Anyway, but it took me, and again, it was feminists in other countries who said you have to listen to women married to state soldiers to understand what the rewards are, and what are the risks of raising questions about militarization. That if you raise questions about military, you are a civilian. You are the spouse of a male soldier, the state soldier. You are a civilian. The militaries and many defense ministries around the world have learned to talk about the military family. Look out, look out, look out, right? But for many women who are married, who are civilians, and married to military men, in fact, that feels as though a kind of belonging. It doesn't feel like danger. It feels like recognition. Maybe you will get a little more attention to the problems of childcare. If you can say that, we are a military family. But for a lot of women who are civilians, it really closes down what they can talk about. I remember a student in a class I was teaching, and the assignment was find somebody on campus, off campus, in your home community, find just one woman. This is hard enough. Find just one woman who, at least at the first, you think may be militarized. Now, you are not to go in and interview that woman so that you can confirm your hunch. You're going in to see, well, maybe not, or maybe I don't really understand it, but find one woman, and you have to have at least 2 conversations, not just one. That was part of the assignment, so you can rethink and then go back. And so your interviewee can also rethink before she talks to you again. Find one woman you think in some way has been militarized. And the papers were amongst the most interesting. Those of you who teach or who are on the verge of teaching, when you stumble on a really good assignment, the way you can tell it's a success is you love reading the papers, right? And I remember reading, they were all interesting. But I remember this one in particular. And it was a woman who decided, undergraduate woman, she decided to interview her sister-in-law. Her brother was a bit older, and thus her sister-in-law was also a bit older than she was, and were out in the waged work world. And her brother worked for one of the big defense contractors down in Hartford, Connecticut, which has a lot of defense contractors. And her brother worked for that, and she was interested in her brother's wife, her sister-in-law, who she got along with really well and everything. And here's the story she told. She said, her sister-in-law is not married to a uniformed military personnel. She's married to an engineer, right, who works in weaponry. And so she said that she talked to her sister-in-law, had a great conversation. She said, her sister-in-law said, when we first got together, your brother and I, when we first got together, God, we talked about everything. One of the things that was so great, and one of the reasons we got together, is we talked about everything. And she said, the sister-in-law said, I majored in political science, and I follow the news, I'm kind of a news junkie, she said, and I like to talk, over dinner and so on, about foreign affairs and all these sorts of things. And said what began to happen as he got this job at this civilian defense contractor, he stopped talking less and less about his work. So the first thing that happened is that his work was classified. And he could talk less and less about it, and that meant it was an unequal sharing, because she had a job, I think as a librarian. She could talk about everything that was going on in the public library near Hartford, but he could talk less and less about the things that obviously he was dealing with every day, that he got a sense of accomplishment from, or that he was worried about, or that were puzzling him. So there was a widening of a silence in the marriage. And then he began to ask her not to talk with him about her views on foreign policy. Now, it wasn't as if his supervisor had snuck in and was sitting under the dinner table, right? It was he was beginning to internalize his own sense of what wasn't appropriate for him as a civilian engineer working in a weapons factory to even be in conversation about it. They were still married when she handed in the paper, but she said it was so distressing to her sister-in-law, because she said there was just a wider and wider pool of silence in the marriage. Now that's something I would never have really thought about, right? And that is the militarization of that marriage. 2 civilians, 2 people who really enjoyed each other, were affectionate towards each other, and yet the militarization of his job was affecting the militarization, the level of militarization in their marriage. So I think that militarization is something that is so valuable for us to chart, because you don't have to know elites to do it. It's good if you do, if you have access, everybody, people should do ethnographies, not just on the people who don't have power, who are usually the people who are most accessible, and that's where most ethnographies are done, right? Laura Nader, Ralph Nader, the safety advocate, his sister is at least as important as Ralph is, and her name is Laura Nader, N-A-D-E-R, and she is an anthropologist. And she says to her students, study up. That's the most famous thing Laura Nader ever is quoted in. Study up. And what she means is take all your ethnographic skills and use them to study people who have power. Don't just imagine that ethnography is only for the powerless. Ethnography can be used to study up. And I think that to make sense of what's happening here, one has to study the creep of militarization. How does it happen? Who resists it? How do they resist it, publicly or privately? And one has to take seriously the concept of patriarchy, not as static, not as abstract, but as woven into all our everyday lives. That's the only way we're going to understand this relationship. It takes a village, though. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia. Wow, I know there are questions, and I will not stand in your way. Please raise your hands.
Hi, I'll keep standing so I can see everybody.
Hi,
How
thanks
you
so
doing?
much for your talk.
Tell me your name.
My name is Maria.
Hi, Maria.
I was wondering about what you said earlier about the nuns versus
Yes.
the military wives, I believe.
No, in this case it was the anti-sexist women in uniform. Yes.
Yes.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, of course the nuns don't necessarily need to see them, they have no problem seeing the patriarchy in the military, right? Because they are not invested.
But they saw the patriarchy in their own church.
They did.
Yes, these nuns did.
Okay, so that was just my question.
Yes.
It seemed like you were saying.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I didn't speak very well. What Mary was comparing was the activist, anti-sexist nuns in the American Catholic Church and their activism within their patriarchal organization with the women in uniform in the American patriarchal military organization. And she compared as to which one of them were willing to go deepest into what the systems really were about.
All right, I understood it as though you were saying the nuns were able to
No,
see
they-
the patriarchy in the military.
Which they do,
They
but,
do,
but that wasn't the
Yes.
comparison. Exactly, exactly.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. And in fact, that's coming back to the Filipino radical nuns. In fact, one of the things that I learned a lot about prostitution around U.S. military bases, because there was a woman named Sister Soledad who organized women in prostitution around the U.S. military bases in the Philippines. And it's the first time, since it never makes the news in the United States, it was the first time I ever thought to understand overseas military bases, I better understand prostitution systems, and I better pay attention to the women who are in prostitution around a U.S. or other countries' military base. It was Sister Soledad. So she did make the connection. Yeah, other things. Yeah, hi. Hi again.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
I just wanted to add two things. Also with the military prostitution next to the military bases, because in Colombia, for example, I also found that the prostitution business increases in areas close to transnational corporations, for example.
Yes.
So that would also be an interesting thing to look more into it.
And in fact, the first time I ever thought about that, Julia, is when I now know, always ask the prostitution question.
Yeah.
Not because it'll be the same, because you don't know. And I first started asking it around banana plantations. And there was a guy who did class analysis, quite good class analysis, around the big multinational banana companies' plantations in Central America especially. And I wrote to him, I was in graduate school with him actually, I really admired him, I thought he was actually a good similar than I was. So I wrote to him and said, oh, have you ever noticed anything about prostitution around the then United Fruit banana plantations? He wrote, this was when people wrote letters. Remember those? Remember letters, right? So I had this letter. But he wrote back this 2-page, single-spaced description, which he had never put in any of his books about the politics of bananas, because he didn't think it explained anything. And so what have you observed around, what kind of multinationals are there? Mining?
Yeah, it's mining and oil companies.
And oil companies.
Yeah, and what I found was that paramilitaries use the prostitution business as a commodity, as a negotiation commodity, basically.
How so?
To have a better negotiation with the multinational corporations officials.
Spell that out. Spell that out.
I haven't looked too much into it.
Yeah, but give us a hint of what you think you're finding.
But what I thought is that paramilitaries were very much implicated in the prostitution business with
paramilitaries, you mean that are pro-state.
Pro-state,
yes,
exactly.
So you have to get your mind into Colombian language here now, right?
Paramilitary
are
right,
not
extreme.
insurgents.
Yeah.
They are pro-state, but not officially recognized militarized groups.
Largely pro-state and also pro-drug traffickers,
pro themselves.
Generally more right-wing than left-wing groups. And they have been working with the multinational corporations in several occasions, and one corporation was the prostitution business, which they built up and using mostly Afro-Descendant indigenous women actually as commodities to negotiate to have better negotiation possibilities with the multinational corporations officials.
Who they presume, I know you aren't
get more financial incentives, get better contracts, and so on.
Always ask the prostitution question. Even if you think prostitution isn't your topic, right? Even if you think you really don't even know how to go about studying it, just ask it. And maybe you'll come out and see, no, actually there's no prostitution around this mining community. I mean, the Bolivians talk about this all the time. You can't study mining unless you study prostitution, right? And it doesn't mean it'll always be the same. It just means you won't understand international corporate investment unless you've looked at the whole workings of patriarchy that support that mining. Right? That's a really good warning.
Yeah, and the second question I wanted to ask is, because you so nicely spelled out the relationship between militarization and patriarchy, what I was wondering is, in order to overcome both militarization and patriarchy, don't we need anti-capitalism, and don't we need to overcome the entire economic order that is actually implicated as well as very much invested in militarism and needs also patriarchy to sustain itself?
Here's been my problem with that way of posing the challenge, and that is too many analysts, too many activists, too many legislators, all three, think that if they tackle capitalism, they will tackle patriarchy automatically. Beware automatically, right? And so no, of course you don't. No, but that is the big challenge, is because it's a hierarchy of causation, right? That is at work there, and there is this presumption that it's not yours. This is the challenge to try and how do you talk about neoliberal capitalism, which has been widening the gaps between rich and poor in country after country. Right? How do you talk about that and take seriously that in fact the rich and the poor are not ungendered, right? That within the rich there is a hierarchy. I don't mean you have to feel sorry for the poor little rich girl. I don't mean that. But there is domestic violence, right? There are all kinds of inequalities within every class. And to imagine that any of us can be uncurious about the workings of patriarchy in order to understand Inco, the big Canadian mining company's operations in Colombia, is crazy. Well, crazy, that's not very analytical, is it? It's not useful enough. Because what we're all in the business of doing, see, I even use business, what we are all trying to do, whether we are in policy making, or we're in political parties, or we're electoral activists, or we are outside of the electoral system in our activism, or we are scholarly analysts, we are trying to explain. And if you collapse patriarchy as if it is just the outcome of some other system, and if it's the outcome of some other system, then you can just study the system you're interested in and not pay any attention to the workings of patriarchy. And that will lead to, amongst other things, profound disappointment. And this is, we've learned this again, coming back to the importance of reading feminist historians. The feminist historians of the Egyptian revolution of the 1922, the feminist historians of the Algerian revolution against the French, the feminist historians of the Chinese revolution of 1930s and 40s, ending in 49, all of them have built up documentation of how the revolution is fought with and dependent on women's efforts and work and risk, and then betrays women when the revolution is over. Why? Because, this sounds, I think, too simple, but because the chief revolutionary strategists actually weren't very interested in patriarchy. They weren't very interested in that kind of abuse, of that kind of oppression. And therefore they lost interest in it afterwards. Listen to Chinese feminists today. They're very, very, very smart. They're under danger, of course, but they are really, really interesting. There's a book out, her last name is an English name, Fincher, but her middle name is Hong. She's, I think, Australian, Asian Australian, and it's called Betraying Big Brother. It's one of the best studies of Chinese feminism today. I was talking earlier about historians. This is now talking about the anti-sexual harassment activists in China today and why it was so hard for them to get traction. And it's partly, if you absorb only one kind of explanation, it is really hard for people to persuade you to have another, more complicated notion of explaining what you think is going on. That's a very long warning to what I know you know already. but it's very enticing, isn't it? Just to take one form of oppression and imagine if you focus just on that, all other liberations will follow. But that actually isn't the way patriarchy has survived revolutions, changes in the fall of empires. Patriarchy is very persistent. Patriarchy is Silicon Valley, folks, right? Patriarchy is not old-fashioned, patriarchy is hip, right? Oh God, I almost went off on a rant.
Claudia here.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much.
Hi,
It's
hi.
good to see you live. I show YouTube videos to my students.
Oh dear.
Now I see you live. It's really great moment for me. I use my your concept of militarization a lot, and I've recently come across an article, I think by Alison Howell, you might know,
Yes,
on martial politics, because she says it's very catchy title, Forget Militarization,
Yeah.
because that term would presume something as a liberal order, peaceful order that is somehow destroyed or perishing through militarization, as if there was something pure that militarization puts in danger. So, do you know it? Do you know that piece? And would you see a relation between the two concepts? Maybe for those who don't know the text, the idea is that martial politics is everywhere.
M-A-R-T-I-A-L.
So martial politics is in our everyday. If you look at modernity from from underneath, from coloniality, from sexism, from racism, then you see martiality everywhere, and you don't need militarization alone to have weaponry and violence.
No, I don't, yes, and I think that is the great advantage of both martial and militarized, is that neither of them presume militaries. All right? That is, it's a package of, I mean, militarization is absorbing bit by bit by bit the whole package of ideas that make up militarism. And I think she and I are probably more in agreement than perhaps it sounds, because I think both of us are interested in civilians, right? That's where militarization has its seedbed, right? And it's, if you think of what is the package of ideas, and you can add more, right? The package of ideas that makes up militarism, and you may only believe one of these, or you may only now believe two of them. You don't yet believe all 8 of them, right? The question is, are you on a slippery slope? There's nothing automatic, right? So one of the first ideas, and it sounds so reasonable, is, and this is a belief now, not a value, that the world is a dangerous place. Right? And that, I know a lot of people who believe that, and they aren't full-blown militarists, right? But it is a starter, right? Because what you have to think about is, what's an alternative way to talk about the world? The world is a creative place. The world is a cooperative place. And then somebody will call you naive, and that means they feminized you, and that means they don't have to take you seriously. Perfect. A second belief, so you have to think about the whole package. The second belief is that it is reasonable to be fearful. Right? Again, that sounds very reasonable. Right? A third belief, these aren't in that order, you may enter the room through any window. That a third belief is that only mature, a state that doesn't have a military is not a mature state. So the US government made a really strong push after the overthrow of Baby Doc and the military government in Haiti, made a really strong push for Haiti to have its own military. And a lot of Haitians, including a lot of Haitian feminists, said any military is a dangerous thing for this small, history-laden society to have. They didn't want to have any military. And the argument back was a militarized way of thinking. And these are arguments made by civilian diplomats in the Clinton administration. The argument was, if you don't have a military, you won't be taken seriously in the international community. You have to have a military, or you're not serious as a state. Yes?
My name is Ruth, and I'm
Hi,
curious.
Ruth.
Anyway, I don't want to say too much because I've worked a lot about prostitution. My dad taught ethics at West Point, and I organized the first event at West Point on human trafficking and prostitution in the military, as far as I know. Anyways, but my question actually has nothing to do with that. I just was in Israel, and of course, it's a very militarized environment.
Yes.
But women make up, I think, half of the, well, at least what you see visibly on the streets of the military. So I just wondered if you studied that, because I've never seen a place where, at least at the entry level,
yes.
You see women as men, as well as many women as men in the military and the streets.
The conscription rules in Israel are such that women who can show that it goes against their religious beliefs as Jewish women to serve in the military can be excused. And it's one of the reasons why amongst all the women, so all the women...
And the men too, the same thing for
yes,
men
right,
who are religious studies.
Because they go off to yeshivas, right? But
is,
amongst all the women in the Israeli military, they are disproportionately Ashkenazi. The second thing is about marriage, right? Which then excludes a lot of women. And the third thing is, once women get into the military, and this is a really good example of how do you fight sexism without bolstering militarism? And Israeli anti-militarized feminists, of which you may not think there are a lot, but there are. Jewish feminist peace activists have been supportive of the breaking down of combat positions for women, and they worked really hard at it. They allied with women who are feminists in the Knesset, which is the name of the Israeli legislature, and they have now some women in the most elite Israeli militarized hierarchy. The most elite, admired posts are fighter pilots. And so that's what they first pushed for, that women should be allowed to fly fighter planes. And they've gotten into it, thanks to the work of the Knesset. But overwhelmingly, women in the Israeli military hold really different positions than men in the military. And so that's why fighting sexism inside the Israeli military still has a real purchase for a lot of feminist activists in the peace movement. That is really a risky thing to count as a success, right? Because it doesn't make the Israeli military just look less backward by having a few. So Israel is really interesting to look at. The debates amongst Israeli feminists are intense, and they oftentimes are very clarifying. I went once to I guess it was supposed to be an underground films in an underground theater in Tel Aviv. It was very underground. And it was a peace activist small meeting. And I remember a woman who was, I think, 18. I mean, it just puts you to shame when you think of people thinking such hard, difficult thoughts and working through things that you hadn't worked through. And she stood up on stage and she's talking to a peace activist group in this underground theater. And she said, I have just refused to be conscripted. Right? Right? And she said, and somebody asked her, how did you come to this decision? She just finished high school. How did you come to this decision? Because she was going to go to jail. How did you come to this decision? She said, I read Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas, which won me over entirely. But here she was 18. I mean, I couldn't even read Virginia Woolf when I was 18. I still barely can. But then here came her warning, and this was about patriarchy, to this very supportive audience. She said, don't you dare turn me into a hero. Don't you dare put me on a pedestal because I'm going to jail. Because most of the people who are going to jail because they are anti-conscription, because they refuse to serve in the military and do their required legal duty, are men. If you make me a hero because I'm simply doing what my brain and soul requires me to do, you are creating hierarchies. And you cannot have a successful peace movement if you create hierarchies. 18. I don't know where you were when you were 18. Because the intensity of the debates and the puzzles were so excruciating in a highly militarized society. Somebody else, yes, you're calling on people.
Yeah, I thought I'm useful here too. I had a Jessica for quite a while and then the weekend.
Thank you, guys. My name is
Hi.
Jessica. First, really like to thank you for your speech. It was amazing to hear you in person.
Oh.
But I thought it was really useful how you broke down patriarchy in these 3 points. And I was hoping that maybe we could go back to what you were saying about militarization just before.
Yeah, sure.
Because that made it a lot clearer for me.
Oh, great, yeah. So which part do you want to kind of swing
So
out?
you were saying sort of there's 8 ways how to see militarization.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. I guess, and I'm still piecing it together myself, and we just kind of started. I see militarism, like any ideology, is a package of beliefs, again, how you think the world works, right? And sometimes it's called what is normal or what is natural, especially natural. That's so loaded. no feminist ever uses the word natural without being told. Those of you who've ever had to teach knows. And if you teach any kind of gender course, you spend all your life going like this. And the reason is because you're constantly throwing skeptical light on something that everybody else thinks is natural, right? So militarism is made up of beliefs about how the world works. It is natural to have enemies. That's just, that's the way the world is, right? And if you come along and say, well, actually, I don't think that's natural. I think enemies are constructed, and societies or groups don't have to construct certain people. They can construct them as rivals, but rival is an enemy, right? They can construct them as different, but different is an enemy, right? You can construct people and acknowledge differences and even competition, right? I'm a big baseball fan, right? Boston Red Sox. I grew up rooting, this is terrible, this is on tape, right? This is on tape. Okay. I grew up rooting for the New York Yankees. Can you believe it? I mean, it's really, but I learned the error of my ways. And so I root for the Red Sox, Boston Red Sox. And so the rivalries are intense, right? But I've never thought of New Yorkers as my enemy. But I think we really have to refine whatever languages we use. We really have to make sure that neither we nor the people we're having a conversation with or a debate with collapse terms that shouldn't be collapsed. And so the belief that it is natural to have enemies is, I think, crucial to the package that makes up militarism. And some people can grow up to the age of 15 and have never thought anybody in the world was an enemy. But you have to be taught who's an enemy. And sometimes it takes a lot of teaching because you don't want to think that, right? And other times you demilitarize yourself because people you used to think of as enemies, you realize are just different and really aren't even rivals at all, right? So the package of ideas includes also, of course, deeply gendered ideas. And amongst the most important gendered idea is that it is natural for men, otherwise known as masculinized humans, right? Because they have to be recognized as such. It is natural for men to be the protectors of women. Now one of the reasons this has such ripple effects is that part of the presumption of militarism is that people who are protected should be grateful to the protector. That's very risky. It's very risky. Also, the presumption is just think of all the things to be a good protector. Just think of all the things that person must be presumed to be good at. And one of the things that the protector is supposed to be good at is knowing the world. Because how can you protect me if you don't know the world better than I do? Right? And that then slips right over into the people who are the natural protectors. To be good protectors should know more about the world than the person who's protected. And that is a key to the domestication of women, right? They do good work, but they don't really understand the world. I, who go out in the world, and this, my feminist geography friends, they watch scope of geographic mobility. And it's one of the most gendered things in any society. Who stays close to home, who is presumed early on to be able to take their bike further, or to walk further, or do the errand further away from home, the boy or the girl. And it's oftentimes the mother who does the teaching of boys can go 3 blocks away, but girls should stay close to home, right? I mean, these things are not just, these gendered ideas and gendered values are not just taught by patriarchal men. if women didn't absorb them, usually in the role of mothers or mothers-in-law or grandmothers, in fact, it'd be very hard to spread these ideas. So, and what I suggest to everybody is, if you know somebody who you think is pretty militarized, not all the way down the spectrum, but further down the spectrum than maybe you think you are, have a really interesting conversation with them about how they think the world works. I mean, a really respectful, curious, not, I'm about to laugh at you, kind of. But they may be a lot more complicated than we imagine. And they've come from somewhere. That is, their ideas come from somewhere. And maybe it is out of a particular experience. Or maybe it's how they were taught. Right? But you really can't get to somebody's understanding of the world unless you really listen, I think.
All right, we're slowly starting to use up our time. I will do the following. I will allow 4 more questions all in all and collect them all, and you do a...
2. No. I can't remember.
You can.
4. Okay. 2 and 2.
That's fine. Then we'll have these 2 ladies here, if I may call you that. Gendered way.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll stand up.
Yeah.
Ulrike, I'm a former politician. But I really, and a long time feminist, I really like the way you now presented also the idea, this different sort of the power dynamics between men and women, because I think that women need to be protected. Because I think that in your example or the example you cited with the nuns and the female soldiers, that made me question one thing, because why are the nuns so much more feminist?
These nuns.
These nuns.
These nuns. Yeah.
Than the female soldiers that were included. And to me, I would say, and I think whether you believe that at all, because these nuns decided not to be neither mothers nor heterosexually married.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess many of the female soldiers were. And so I think this idea of women, and in former times, being a nun was the only way for women to live their own life and not to depend on a man.
Yeah.
Because I think part of the story is that all this protection and that the control over women's bodies and sexualities has to do with women are only seen as being whole individuals if you have a man by your side.
Yeah, right.
Because many of them get asked, are you going to marry? Which man gets asked?
Yeah.
Important men, when you interview them, or journalists say, it never talks on Wikipedia. Look how many important men have wives or children.
Yeah.
But how many important women have husbands or children?
Yeah.
So I think for me this is part of the patriarchal system. That this control also means that as a woman you learn that you only are a whole woman if you have a man by your side, and usually also if you're a mother.
Yeah.
And this for me is a big struggle also to independence. No matter whether you are straight or lesbian or don't live with anybody at all. So I think for me that would be the nun thing. I really like that.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting, because many nuns, of course, are deeply patriarchal, right? But what's interesting is about these radical nuns who really made anti-sexism part of being of doing the service they are committed to do. And I think you're right. I think it's one that I remember having a conversation with a young woman who was a waitress at a kind of alternative restaurant. Her name was Helen. And she said, well, when I came out of high school, she went to a Catholic girls' school, high school. She said, you had a choice. We I and my girlfriends, we thought there's a choice. We're just about to graduate from this all-girls high school. We can either join, because what she said, all of my girlfriends did not want to get married right away at the age of 17 or 18. We wanted to put off marriage and delay it, or maybe not at all, but at this point they only talked as high school girls as delaying it. And they said that we had to choose one of 2 paths that our parents thought was acceptable because we would be protected. And one was to join the military, and the other was to become a nun. And she became a nun. And I think one of the things, then she became a radical nun. And one of the things that, if you want to read a really interesting book about these transformations is there is a collection called, it's now a classic, called Lesbian Nuns. And it was about, it's interviews with women in the US, I think it's all in the US, who decided to join a Catholic women's order during Vatican II. This really makes a difference. Generation makes a difference, not your age, your historical generation. When these women joined women's Catholic orders, they were so inspired by the social reform agenda of Vatican II, they thought that joining a nun's organization would allow them to have a positive impact on society. And then Vatican II ended, and many of them left, right? But the other thing is that as nuns, they live in all women's communities, which are often very hierarchical and can be very oppressive. So let's not go into romanticizing these. But it allows a lot more conversation, right? So that's, I think, it's another thing that I was never taught. I know now you all think about it because you're much smarter in your political analysis. But I was never taught to be serious about investigating, understanding, thinking cross-nationally about marriage. I mean, again, that's what sociologists did, maybe anthropologists did. That certainly isn't what political scientists did. And now I think about it all the time because so many states and so many international organizations are so vested in certain marriage systems. Do you know the World Bank? Are any of you economists? Okay, you know this. Okay. To get banks to change their categories of analysis are really hard. The World Bank, until recently, thanks to feminist economists who just kind of, beat them to grow up, the World Bank in their official reports talked about, this is their category, farmers and their wives. If you don't think that's funny, listen again, right? Farmers and their wives, right? And that's the World Bank with an investment in marriage to make sense of economies, right? So always ask the prostitution question, always ask the marriage question, right? If you look at amongst the white women who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, right? Amongst white women, overwhelmingly, well, Latinx women, about 70% voted for Hillary Clinton, 30%, because the Latinx community is, of course, very diverse, depends on how much anti-communism there is in your own Latinx family. I mean, well, it depends whether you're Cuban American or Mexican American, really. So the Latinx vote is, you really have to break it apart. You have to really be careful. With the African American vote, I think 92% of black men voted for Hillary Clinton, 95% of black women voted for her. But if you take the white women's vote in 2016, the single most useful predictor of whether that white woman voted for Clinton or voted, it doesn't mean all now, watch, predictors are not, or voted for Trump. Married white women were much more likely to vote for the Republican candidate than were women who were outside of marriage, but were white. So marriage, it has an effect on how we see the world, how we make choices, how we evaluate our own benefit, and who we think we're responsible to. Oh, now see, how can we do this?
We cannot do this. Okay. We're just going to have one more question.
I have the privilege.
You have the privilege. Sorry for sloppy sharing. I'm just so invested myself in all these
I'm
questions.
grateful for that. My name is Brigitte Holzer, and I want to tell a story or a perception that really can't come into terms with and to hear your comment. I once was working for ULEX, the Rule of Law mission in Kosovo as general advisor, and I had good connections with
Kosovo.
In Kosovo. That was 9 years ago. and I had good connections with a very strong women's movement there.
Yes.
And I think in 2011 there was an exhibition organized by the women's movement, and you might know who it was, because Ulrike was the rapporteur for the European Parliament for Kosovo. Yeah. And this exhibition was pictures of women in the police. We haven't talked about police.
You can militarize
It's-
anything,
yeah.
obviously.
No, and so in the 0 years, there were 18% of the police force was female.
Right.
So it was a kind of economic security, career path,
Sure.
or whatever motivation. So there were these beautiful pictures, women in uniforms, on the wall. And there were also some postcards of these pictures were distributed.
Wow.
But one of those pictures was also men, two policemen, and showing their guns, their pistols. And one could take these some postcards home, and this very strong Kosovo Albanian feminist, she chose that picture of the two men with the pistols, and I felt a bit uneasy, and I really can't say what kind of feeling I had, but I didn't like it. And I asked her, why do you choose this picture? And then she said, because it is protection. So you use also the term protection. And what would be your comment on that? I could understand rationally, and maybe she wanted to be protected because there was a war and the Serbs and so on, and the NATO. But why was this of strong feminist? The attraction was towards a man with pistols.
Even when she's been working, I mean, the KLA is quite patriarchal, right?
Yeah.
And it is possible to be a Kosovar feminist and really admire the KLA, right? I mean, feminism and being a feminist doesn't mean that you've got it all figured out, right? And that's a really good, it's just a great story to be left with, to try and, not that we can make sense of it, but to realize, there's somebody who I would find really interesting before I went to this exhibit. And now I really don't understand it. The security sector and security sector reform is one of the biggest peace-building efforts. And security sector means the intelligence services, the police services, the militaries, and the judiciary, and the prison services. That's the security sector. They are not the same. The gender and security sector, Swami works on this, the gender and security sector reform is to get more women into all 5 of those security sectors. But what if you do that without changing the culture of any one of those services? Thanks, everybody.